So a little over a year ago, I started wearing an Aura sleep ring that my husband got me to track my sleep because I, as long as I can remember, have slept absolutely garbage trash horribly. Let me tell you, when I first started wearing this ring, look at my sleep score. It was a 58 out of 100. Now look at my sleep score, 91. And I'm going to tell you, I've told you before, but I'm here to tell you again, it is thanks to Beam Dream Tea. I am obsessed with this. I started drinking it 9 months ago now. I drink it every single night. It's like my treat before bed. It tastes like hot chocolate, and it helps me fall asleep, stay asleep, and wake up feeling refreshed, not groggy, unlike melatonin, Ambien, all of the other things I've tried, which also never even helped me sleep. I always toss and turn, and when I'm up in the middle of the night, my mind's going, I'm up. Not with Beam. It has been such a game changer in my life. My husband drinks it too. I've gotten my mom hooked on it, my sister hooked on it. So many of you guys are hooked on it now. It is just the best. It has melatonin, it has L-theanine, it has magnesium, and it comes in so many amazing flavors. Cinnamon cocoa, sea salt caramel, which is the one that tastes like hot chocolate, chocolate peanut butter, white chocolate peppermint, chocolate raspberry, mint chip, which is new, and now also just in time for fall, pumpkin spice. You guys have to try it. It is the best. The proof is in the science. Look at my scores, where I was, where I'm at now. I'm so much happier. I'm such a more pleasant person to be around when I'm well rested. I drink it 30 minutes before I want to be asleep, and then I'm asleep and I stay asleep. And I know so many of you now that have tried it love it too, because I get all your messages all the time. So I was drinking this long before Beam was a partner of the channel. So when they reached out and said they wanted to partner, it was honestly a no-brainer. And what I love is that not only do I get to share this with you guys, but I get to pass along savings to you, because you can subscribe and save 20%, plus get an additional 20% off on top of that, making it 40% off. Plus, you can also get a free frother with my code 10TOLIFE. So just click my link in my description or scan the QR code that's on the screen. That's up to 40% off the original price. And if you sign up for the subscription model, which I do because it just delivers monthly, I don't even have to think about it, you can pause, skip, or cancel anytime. There's no risk. You could also buy a one-off. It is the best, guys. You're going to love it. I know so many of you already do because I see you in my DMs. My whole family's hooked on it now. If you struggle with sleep, try Beam Dream Sleep Tea. Gift it to a friend, gift it to yourself. Tell me what you think. I'm telling you, it has honestly just changed my sleep completely. The few years after high school graduation can be some of the most fun and challenging years of our lives. You go from having no responsibilities to the many different expectations of being an adult. Most people are struggling to figure out who they really are, who their friends are, and what they want to do with their lives. Most young adults also make some mistakes and sometimes get involved with the wrong kind of people along the way. Guilty. It's almost like a rite of passage, kinda. But every so often, those wrong people can end up far, far worse than anyone ever expected. And that is what happened in the case we will be reviewing today. Hey guys, I'm Annie Elise. This is 10 to Life. Let's jump right in. Heather Elvis was born on June 3rd, 1993 in Horry County, South Carolina. She was the middle child and had an older brother named Christopher, who was about 10 years older than her. She also had a younger sister named Morgan, who was about 4 years younger than her. Despite the 4-year age gap, she and Morgan were extremely close. Her parents, Terry and Debbie, just adored all 3 of their children, and they really were close to a picture-perfect family. They were happy. They all loved each other. Now, growing up, Heather was a bit shy, but as she got older, she began to really come into herself and to her personality, like so many of us do. Heather grew up near the beach and had a passion for diving. When she was younger, you could always find her at the beach and in the water. Heather was known to absolutely adore animals and kids, and she would often spend her time volunteering to help babysit the kids at the Southern Baptist Church that they had attended as a family. She was known as being just such a kind-hearted person, and one year she even went on a mission trip to Costa Rica to help with unsafe housing in one of their small villages. Upon coming back from her trip in Costa Rica, she was so moved by the emotions shown by the people that she had helped. And in fact, she was so moved that the very next day after coming home from the trip, she went down to the town's orphanage and was teaching the kids there how to read. Anyone who knew Heather adored her, and especially adored her gentle spirit and the way in which she was just always actively seeking to help those around her. She graduated in 2011 from St. James High School in Murrells Inlet and decided to pursue cosmetology, which she had a deep passion for. Right out of high school, Heather had 2 waitressing jobs, one at a Celtic-themed bar called the Tilted Kilt in Myrtle Beach, and another at House of Blues in North Myrtle Beach. She had also recently moved into a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate from out of state. This roommate was named Bree Worrelman, and Bree and Heather very quickly became best friends and even co-workers at the Tilted Kilt. Like most 20-year-olds, Heather had definitely taken an interest in men and dating. She had once tweeted that she had a taste for older men, but it wasn't until June of 2013, just shortly after her 20th birthday, that someone had really caught her attention. She was working a regular shift at the Tilted Kilt when a repairman named Sydney Moorer came into the bar to repair some of the kitchen equipment. Sydney was 37 years old, making him quite a bit older than Heather, and was also a well-known welder in the area. He started his own business in 2002 called Palmetto Maintenance, which was a mobile welding service company. He provided his services to many different businesses around town, such as the Tilted Kilt, where Heather worked. He had extremely good reviews and many positive recommendations, which meant that overall his business was a thriving and successful hit in the local community. Heather was immediately infatuated with him, and the feeling turned out to be very mutual. Coworkers said that Sydney would often come into the restaurants on days that Heather was working, bringing her coffee and bagels, and Heather even started to open up to them about the relationship that the two of them shared. Heather often tweeted about her feelings and her relationship too with Sydney, saying things like, "I'm in too deep, but watch me get deeper." Another one that said, "One of these days I will drag that man into the mop closet and have my way with him, Lord have mercy." And another, "Baby, I did a bad thing." Now, to the average person, this just might seem like a normal relationship between 2 consenting adults. But what the 2 of them had was anything but a normal relationship. In fact, it was a secret affair. Sydney was actually married and had 3 children. And Heather knew about his marriage, and it wasn't something that she was proud of, but she continued to have the relationship anyway. She even changed her Facebook status to "in a relationship" in July of 2013, but didn't put who she was in the relationship with. Her coworkers even knew about their relationship and that he was married, and they often teased Heather, calling her names, and sometimes would even call the Tilted Kilt asking specifically for Heather, pretending to be his wife, trying to play a prank on her. Sydney, on the other hand, didn't blink an eye at the fact that he was being unfaithful in his marriage. That was until his wife, 40-year-old Tammy Moorer, discovered what had been going on with the 2 of them in September of 2013, just 3 months into their affair, and she decided to put an end to things herself. Tammy understandably became extremely upset and angry at Sydney. This had not been the first time that Sydney had been unfaithful in the marriage, causing Tammy to constantly question him and be suspicious of him. Friends of Sydney said that Tammy was extremely domineering toward Sydney. She told him where to work, when to work, and what to do. And in many aspects, I guess you could say that Sydney was extremely submissive to her. I guess besides the fact that he was a cheater. Unsure of what to do to save her marriage and her family, Tammy made Sydney call Heather and end things with her while she was with him and could hear the conversation, listening in on the phone call. Now, this was the first time that Heather had ever spoken to Tammy, and Tammy went absolutely insane on Heather. She called her names and belittled her during the call and told her that she was nothing to Sydney, just someone who spread her legs. Like many aspects in their life, Tammy dominated this entire call, but this would not be the end of Tammy's over-the-top reactions to the affair. So in order to keep Sydney faithful to her, after learning about the affair with Heather, she allegedly would handcuff his hands to their bed every single night. She also changed all of the passwords in his phone to only the ones that she knew. And then she also went with him everywhere outside of the house, no matter if it was a grocery run or a work call. She was not letting him out of her sight. She even allegedly forced him to get her name tattooed on his lower stomach. And just like every other rule and restriction that she enforced, He gladly followed it in order to save their marriage. Now, in my opinion, let me say, it seems a little obsessive. If you have to do that to ensure that your spouse is faithful, it probably is best just to get a divorce. So the following months were some of the hardest for Heather in all of this. Even though their relationship had only lasted for 3 months, she was extremely heartbroken. She tweeted on September 20th, "Once upon a time, an angel and a devil fell in love. It did not go well." She thought that what they had shared together was real, and it hit her very hard that she could no longer talk to Sydney. But this wasn't the only thing that was causing Heather trouble. Even though all of Tammy's restrictions made her feel slightly better about the relationship and the home life that she shared with Sydney, it was not enough for her. After all, hell hath no fury like a scorned woman. Tammy refused to leave Heather alone. She was determined to make her life a living hell, and she was doing an extremely good job at it. She sent Heather endless threatening texts and calls from Sydney's phone. She sent explicit pictures of the two of them having sex to Heather's phone, and she even called the Tilted Kilt over and over again, threatening that Sydney would no longer do repairs for them as long as Heather worked there, all in an attempt to get her to lose her job, and many of the times it almost worked. One day after Tammy had been calling repeatedly, they ended up sending Heather home for the night, unsure of what else to do. Despite Tammy having what seemed like complete control over Sydney's phone, he somehow managed to reach out to Heather in all of this. He told Heather that Tammy also had a lover, so it wasn't the fact that he had cheated on her that she was upset about, but the fact that he had lied to her about the affair that sent her over the edge. He had confirmed with Heather, though, that their relationship needed to end for his marriage's sake and was truly over, and she willingly agreed on one condition, that Tammy leave her alone for good, which Sydney gladly agreed to, and for a while, it seemed like Tammy was finally leaving Heather alone. Both Heather and Sydney were moving on with their lives after the affair. Heather had gotten a new job at a beauty parlor in Myrtle Beach, beginning her work in the cosmetology field. She had even started going back to church with her best friend Bree. Even though things were starting to look up after her heartbreak, her coworkers at the Tilted Kilt, where the waitresses wore pretty revealing clothing, began to notice that Heather was putting on a significant amount of weight, and her uniform had even gone up 3 bra sizes within the span of a few months. Now, this isn't extremely uncommon. Some people respond with grief and heartbreak in different ways, but Heather had confided in some of her coworkers that she was concerned about the possibility of being pregnant, possibly with Sydney's baby. Her manager at the Tilted Kilt even said that she took a pregnancy test on the clock, but that it came back as an error. It was never reported if she took another one to confirm or deny if she was pregnant. After a couple of months of being single, Heather decided that it was time to start dating again. So on December 17th, she had plans to go on a date with a man named Stephen Schiraldi. Heather had known Stephen since high school, and she was really looking forward to their date and finally getting her mind off all of that chaos that had been happening with the Moorers. The two of them went to dinner and finished the evening driving around looking at Christmas lights. They really seemed to be hitting it off, and Stephen even taught her how to drive his stick-shift vehicle. Heather had texted her dad a picture of her driving his car, saying, "Just learned how to drive stick. I'm a pro." The date had gone better than Heather had ever even expected. The two of them parted ways when Stephen dropped her off back at her apartment at around 1:15 a.m. Heather was moving on, and so was Sydney. The Moorers were working on their marriage and had also decided that they would go on a family road trip with their kids to California. They would go in their brand new Ford F-150. The plan was to go to Disney from November 19th to December 11th. It seemed like everyone was finally getting their own happy endings after all of the turmoil and drama. But then everything changed. On December 18th, Heather's father, Terry Elvis, was woken up to police knocking on his door. This wasn't extremely out of the ordinary since he had some friends on the police force that would drop by and chat with him from time to time. But the police told Terry that they had been called about a suspicious car that had been parked and unattended for a long period of time at the Peachtree Boat Landing, which was about 8 miles away from Myrtle Beach. And when police ran the tags, they found that the car belonged to none other than his daughter Heather, which was still registered under his name. They immediately knew that something was not right. So Terry and Debbie began frantically calling Heather over and over again, but Heather wasn't answering the phone. Besides Heather's usual mess in her car, the car itself was still in perfect condition. All of the tires had air in it, all of the windows were intact, and the doors were locked. The only suspicious part was that Heather herself wasn't in it, and neither were any of her belongings. Police searched the vehicle but didn't find her wallet, phone, or purse in the car, which were things that Heather always had kept with her. Her parents understandably were freaked out, and Terry told the police, "This is totally out of the ordinary. Heather has never done anything like this before. Something is wrong here." Police were trying to keep them calm and decided that they would go and check in her apartment. Now, really quick, think back to when you were 20 years old. I knew a lot of people who would go out, have something to drink, leave their car parked somewhere overnight, and depending on how intoxicated they were, it wasn't uncommon for them to just pass out and not have charged their phone and not have it on. So it's definitely something that has happened and could have happened. But when police arrived at Heather's apartment, they found no one. Bree was already back home for the holidays visiting her family, so the only person who would have been there was Heather. But unfortunately, she was nowhere to be found. And this was when police really began kicking things into high gear and launched a full-on investigation. Police went to Heather's work, but she wasn't scheduled until the next day on the 20th, so no initial alarm bells went off from her work friends about her being missing. Her manager, however, immediately told police that if they were going to look into anyone, it should be Sidney Moorer, and then briefly gave a background about who he was and what their relationship was. When police spoke to Sidney on the 20th, he told them that he was completely over Heather and hadn't been in contact with her since their breakup a few months prior. He also told police that his family had just gotten back on the 11th from their vacation, and that on the night of the 17th, he and Tammy were running errands, including stopping at a Walmart to buy a pregnancy test for her, meaning that he was nowhere near the Peachtree Landing area. So the police, with that information, kept the investigation going and looked elsewhere, looked for more tips and leads. Now, Heather's dad remembered that Heather had sent him a phone from Stephen's car on the 17th, which led police directly to Stephen's front door for questioning. However, everything with Stephen checked out. He had dropped Heather off at home, and her car was still at her complex at the time he dropped her off. He also had an alibi for the rest of the night. So police and Heather's parents were trying to piece together anything that they could of the night of the 17th, but nothing was quite making sense. Stephen had been the last person to see Heather, but why had she left the house after her date with him, especially in the middle of the night? Or had she even left the house at all? How did her car end up at the boat dock? It wasn't until police finally contacted Bree that they began to piece more things together, little by little. Bree told police that Heather had called her late on the 17th after she had gotten home from her date. She immediately answered the phone, eager to hear how it had gone, especially since she had seen firsthand how rough the past few months had been on Heather. But when she answered the phone, it wasn't a giddy and excited Heather on the other line. She was hysterically crying, and she told Bree that Sidney had called her. Bree was almost a little annoyed by this, and she said that she remembered thinking to herself, "I thought we were past all of this." So she asked Heather why she had even answered the phone, but Heather told her that she didn't answer it intentionally. It had been from a random number. Heather told Bree in tears that Sidney had told her that he had left his wife, that he was sorry for everything that had happened between the two of them, and that he wanted to see her and be with her. So Bree did as any good friend would, and calmed her down a bit. And she told her, "Don't do it. Why don't you just go to sleep? Sleep on this and we'll talk about it first thing in the morning." And Heather had seemed to agree with Bree. Besides, it was getting late at this point, and we all know that nothing comes from late night emotions. So the two ended the phone call on a more positive note. But Bree had no idea that that would be the last time that she would ever speak to her best friend. The police, who had endless questions before, now had some answers, and these answers were extremely contradicting to what Sidney had previously told them. He had called Heather, begged for her back, and chances are she left the apartment after she ended that call with Bree so that she could go and see him. Investigators looked into Heather's cell phone records since Bree had tipped them off that Sidney hadn't called her from his phone number. And sure enough, in her records were calls from an unusual number. First from, and then back to a number, starting at around 1:35 a.m. on the morning of December 18th, just hours before police were notified about Heather's car. She had called the phone number back a total of 9 times. Police traced that phone number back to the payphone that it was coming from, and by some shred of luck, there were surveillance cameras close by, and these cameras were working and monitoring everyone that used the phones. Although they were able to retrieve the footage, it was extremely grainy. They could tell that a man was in fact using the phone at those exact times, but couldn't be certain that it was Sydney. Based on what we knew from Bree, though, they decided to bring him in for questioning and see what information they could get out of him. He again told them that he and Tammy had been running errands and went to Walmart to buy a pregnancy test for her. They flat out asked Sydney if he had contacted Heather through a payphone at all that night, which he said no to, but investigators decided to take a chance and went ahead and told Sydney that they had surveillance footage of him at the payphone. And this turned out to be the right move because it made Sydney change his entire story. He admitted that it was him at the payphone, but said that the entire phone call was him telling her to please leave me alone, not trying to beg for her back, but trying to beg her to leave him alone. Surveillance footage and Walmart receipts showed that Sydney had been at least somewhat telling the truth. Sydney is seen entering Walmart, where he stayed for 7 minutes, purchasing a pregnancy test and a cigar. Just a few minutes later at 1:35 a.m., he was seen from Kangaroo gas station surveillance on Joe White Avenue, making that phone call to Heather from the payphone. What wasn't making any sense, however, was the story he was telling about how they just had a quick little chat to get Heather to leave him alone. Heather's phone records showed that the calls went back and forth until around 2:09 a.m., almost 40 minutes after that initial call. Her records also showed that she called Sydney's personal phone multiple times from 3:17 a.m. to 3:21 a.m. before they had a conversation that lasted around 4 minutes. Shortly after this phone call, her car is seen on surveillance footage from 2 different cameras just up the road from the boat docks. And shortly after her car is seen, Sydney's brand new Ford F-150 is also seen, driving directly toward where her car was found. This at 3:36 a.m. Just 20 minutes later, at 3:41 a.m., Heather's cell phone goes dead or is shut off. And at 3:45 a.m., the F-150 is seen driving back in the opposite direction away from the boat docks. Even though he admitted to speaking to Heather on the payphone, he denied being anywhere near the boat docks. Footage was too grainy to catch a specific license plate on the truck, even though it had matched the exact truck he had. So based on this new information, it was leading investigators to believe that Sydney and Tammy were the last people who spoke to Heather, and possibly the last people who saw her alive. So they both had some real explaining to do. On December 20th, Horry County Police Department Lieutenant Peter Sestar was dispatched with other investigators to the Moorer home. At the time, the case was still classified as a missing person and not a criminal investigation, so they had no search warrant allowing them extensive access to the house. However, Tammy decided to cooperate with them and allowed them to enter the home. She followed the investigators room to room, where they were allowed to snap photos from the main rooms and the doorways, but again, they weren't allowed to thoroughly investigate any part of the home. The lieutenant noted that he saw 3 cameras on the outside of the house and 1 at the top of the staircase inside. He didn't take direct photos of the cameras and also tried to make looking at them as discreet as possible, in an attempt to not show Tammy that he had seen them. He knew that with a search warrant in the future, these cameras might have answers as to where Heather was. So just 1 week later, police obtained a search warrant and also brought the family truck into police headquarters. Now, a few huge things were found during this search. The first was that the camera system in the home was completely different from the ones that he saw just 1 week prior, and the original camera that he had seen at the top of the stairs was now missing. But even though they had made efforts to get an entirely new security system, they still did not cover their tracks completely. On December 23rd at around 4 p.m., Sydney, Tammy, and Tammy's sister Ashley were all seen on camera extensively cleaning out the truck. Tammy was seen taking a significant amount of time to clean the passenger side interior of the truck, and while Tammy and Ashley were cleaning the truck, Sydney could be seen starting a burn pile in the yard, where all 3 of them began throwing towels that were used to clean the truck into the fire. Now, I don't know about all of you, but when I clean my car out, I usually just rewash the dirty rags like a normal person, and I definitely do not burn each and every rag that was used. Investigators didn't test the DNA once the truck was in their possession, since they thought that if Heather had been in the truck at one point, there likely wouldn't be anything left, DNA-wise. However, they were determined to get some kind of useful evidence from the truck. When investigators looked a little deeper into the truck, they realized, like many, it had a GPS system. They figured out that this specific GPS system could be disengaged, and ironically enough, the one and only time that it ever had been disengaged was on the night that Heather went missing. The SD card from the truck had been removed at 12:07 a.m. on December 18th, which was just before all of the calls started happening. Once the SD card is removed, the GPS system will not work, so the timing of it all was just a little too perfect. Despite the evidence that they had found so far and the investigators' best efforts to piece together what happened, Christmas passed by, and Heather still remained missing. It seemed like all signs were pointing toward Sydney and Tammy, yet they remained free. It wasn't until over a month later that any arrests were even made regarding Heather's case, and interestingly enough, it was neither of the Moores. On January 28, 2014, William Christopher Barrett and Garrett Ryan Starnes were arrested and charged with obstruction of justice. Now, if you're confused on who these people are, you are not alone, because they had no relation to Heather or her disappearance whatsoever. Both men had posted information on social media about the case that was either false or misleading, which caused investigators to waste time looking further into the posts, but both of the men were released on bond. Then another break, in February. In February of 2014, it wasn't police and investigators coming to Sydney, but rather Sydney coming to them. Sydney claimed that his family was receiving endless amounts of hate and threatening messages toward himself, Tammy, and even their kids. He told police that twice in February people had fired at his vehicle and threatened him with weapons while he was driving on local roads with his family, all due to all of the publicity regarding their possible involvement in the case. He also told officers that people had followed him and his family to their home and had even killed and mutilated their pets. Despite him claiming to have heard bullets hit the truck, investigators found no signs of his truck ever being hit. So it kinda seemed as if he was just drawing attention to himself and playing the victim card, like his life was being ruined all because of someone from his past. During this time, Sydney wasn't the only one playing victim either. Tammy was very openly responding to comments and making posts on Facebook regarding Heather's disappearance, but she had very little sympathy at all for Heather. She was calling Heather names like twisted, psycho, whore, and hoe. So while the two were still complaining and playing victim, police were doing everything they possibly could do to tie Sydney and Tammy to Heather's disappearance. On February 21st, 2014, police blocked off the section of South Carolina Highway 814 next to the Moores' home, and they executed a second search warrant on the property. When they arrived at the family home, both Tammy and Sydney were asleep in their master bedroom, along with their 3 kids, a 14-year-old boy, a 12-year-old girl, and an 8-year-old girl. The house was in complete disarray. 2 long guns were found just leaning against a wall, and a third subcompact pistol was resting on the nightstand beside the bed. There was meat and other foods lying on the kitchen table that had been there so long that it was molding and completely rotting. Trash was also everywhere, and the backyard was completely covered in animal feces. The home was extremely unsanitary and, quite honestly, unlivable for their children. After searching the home for 11 long and grueling hours, both Sydney and Tammy Moore were arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts each of indecent exposure. At the news conference shortly after their arrest, investigators told the media that the charges of obstruction of justice were from Sydney initially lying about using a payphone, and the indecent exposure charges were from sexually explicit photos found on their phones that were taken in public places. They did not comment on what was found to support the murder and the kidnapping charges, though. The Moores very quickly posted the $20,000 bond set for the obstruction and exposure charges, but later waived the bond on the kidnapping charges in favor of the murder charges. Investigators announced that they would be making additional charges against the Moores unrelated to Heather's disappearance. It turns out that the two of them were involved in a bit of a Medicaid fraud, failing to disclose in an application for benefits the income that they had made from their businesses. Despite every single sign that pointed to Sydney and Tammy being extremely guilty, they gained a ton of support on social media. They had sadly painted the narrative that Heather was this insane stalker who would not leave them alone and was determined to put an end to their big, happy family. They even suggested online that since Heather's dad, Terry, knew people in the police force, the investigators had framed them and were protecting the real killer in the case. Heather's family received an endless amount of hateful and harassing messages online because of this. Majority of the people were victim-blaming Heather. To many people online, she was the homewrecker who shouldn't have gotten involved in someone's family. It seemed as if a lot of people never thought to question or reprimand Sydney, who was just as guilty, if not more, since he was the one who was married. In early 2015, the judge accepted Tammy's mother's house as collateral sufficient to guarantee the $100,000 bond on their murder charges. So Sydney and Tammy both were released after being held for 11 months. Heather's family was absolutely heartbroken at this news, and even fought back against it. They brought up the endless threats that they had been receiving online from the Moores' supporters, but the judge was not budging. He required that Sydney and Tammy both wear GPS ankle monitoring and stay at least 5 miles away from the Elvis home at all times, and also avoid any interaction with them on social media. So Sydney and Tammy were finally able to be home with their children after almost a full year in prison. But this was not good enough for them. They claimed that due to the publicity and constant threats from the community, neither one of them could find jobs. So the court allowed them to move to Florida, where Sydney did end up finding a job. They were required to meet their bail conditions and waive extradition from Florida if they violated the terms. And then they were off on their merry way to the Sunshine State, all while Heather's family was left in South Carolina with no answers and still searching endlessly for Heather. In March of 2016, the murder charges against both Sydney and Tammy Moore were dismissed. The charges of indecent exposure were also dropped as well, and the obstruction of justice charges against Tammy were dropped too. Sydney, though, still faced an obstruction of justice charge, and the couple still faced charges of kidnapping in connection to Heather's disappearance.
It's very disappointing that the murder charges are dropped, but I also feel like there were things that I wasn't looking forward to sitting through a courtroom listening to in that aspect. So I feel like maybe it's God's grace that we don't have to sit and listen to that right now.
Just 3 months later, on June 20th, 2016, the first trial regarding the kidnapping charges against Sydney began. The first day consisted of testimony beginning with Heather's manager as well as another co-worker of hers at the Tilted Kilt. Her manager described seeing firsthand the progression and end of the relationship between Heather and Sydney, as well as Heather's possible pregnancy.
Did that relationship progress?
It did.
Okay. And if you don't mind, tell this jury, would he come in and see her on days he wasn't even working?
Yes, he would come in during the day, and he would bring her coffee and bagels,
Okay.
or tea and bagels.
And did that happen on a regular basis?
It did.
Okay. Were there any other men bringing her coffee up there?
No.
Were there any other men coming to see her up there?
No.
During this time when she's working at Tilted Kilt and she's with the defendant, do you ever notice any changes in her physical appearance?
Yes.
Okay, and if you don't mind, tell the jury about that.
Okay. I was in charge of the uniforms at Tilted Kilt, so their bra, their shrug, and their kilt were all provided by us. She had to change her bra out from a A cup to a B cup, and then later to a C cup, and also she needed a bigger kilt.
Okay. And what did she think was causing these physical changes?
At first, from the A cup to the B cup, she really wasn't thinking much, just that she gained some weight. But then she started to get concerned when she had to go to the C cup and get the kilt.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did she ever take any kind of pregnancy test?
She took one at Tilted Kilt in the restroom, yes.
Okay. And And if you don't mind, did you see the pregnancy test?
I did.
Okay. And tell this jury what it said.
It said error, and I went into the office and looked up why a pregnancy test would say error, and it said that either it was inconclusive or she did not urinate on it enough.
Okay.
Like we said earlier, their relationship was well known to other coworkers and people at the restaurant. The harassment that Heather faced after Tammy found out what was going on was even more well known among her coworkers. They saw almost daily how Heather was changing for the worse.
And if you don't mind, tell this jury about what went on when that relationship ended.
She got a lot of nasty text messages and became very fearful, I would say. She just wasn't Heather. She was normally a bubbly, outgoing person, and she became the complete opposite.
And had you ever seen her like that before?
No, ma'am.
Day 2 of the trial came around, and Heather's date from the 17th, Stephen, was the first to testify. He recalled the details of their first date and how the night had ended with him dropping her off back at her apartment shortly after 1 a.m., safe and sound. Others to testify were the 2 responding officers who found Heather's car on the morning of the 18th, a detective in the violent crimes unit that was assigned to Heather's case, as well as the crime scene investigators who were called to the home of Terry Elvis to investigate Heather's car.
Did you find a cell phone in her car?
No, ma'am.
Did you find any car keys in her car?
No, ma'am.
When you went to the landing, did you find a phone at the landing?
No, ma'am, I did not.
Did you find a set of car keys at the landing?
No, ma'am, I did not.
Okay. Did you find any broken glass or weapon?
No, ma'am, I did not.
Okay. Did you find any illegal drugs at the landing?
No, ma'am, I did not.
Okay.
A more in-depth look at the security camera footage was shown. It showed Sydney's whereabouts on the night of the 17th from the Walmart parking lot, all the way to the inside of Walmart shopping and checking out, as well as the gas station cameras near the payphone. Up until the 4th day of trial, everyone's testimony was a lot of the same information that the media had already heard, time and time again. But on that 4th and final day, Heather's best friend and roommate Bree took the stand. Bree knew more details, and Bree had witnessed more firsthand information about their relationship than any other person who testified. Many people had previously been ridiculing Bree for her actions after Heather went missing, because she changed her last name due to publicity and moved out of the state. But throughout her testimony, I think most people could see and feel through her speaking during the trial that she had one mission left, and it was to do whatever she possibly could to take down Sydney and Tammy for all of the pain that they caused her best friend. Bree confirmed in her testimony that Sydney had been the one to call Heather in the early morning of the 18th. She said that Heather was scared and stressed, and that Sydney wanted to meet up with her that night. After 7 long hours of deliberation, the jury informed the judge that they were completely divided. 10 of them wanted to convict, but 2 did not. Due to this hung jury, the judge declared a mistrial.
I received a note from Mr. Lang, and he indicates the jury is still deadlocked and will be unable to resolve it. The jury has received instruction, they're still deadlocked. Therefore, I'll declare a mistrial. In this case, will have to be tried again.
On the 2nd day of the trial, Sydney had spoken to a news outlet about the trial, which was a violation of the court-ordered gag order. He said that he knew about the gag order but wanted to speak because of his wife.
I was actually buying it for my wife. She was in the vehicle when I bought it for her. She took it that night, and it was negative like so many before and after. Not really so much damaging as I guess maybe leading the jury into something to maybe try to get them to believe something that's not so.
He wanted to clear up that the pregnancy test he bought that night was not for Heather, but was for his wife, because apparently they had been trying to have another baby for quite some time. Due to this violation, he was sentenced after the mistrial to 5 months in jail, and he was released after only 2 months on good behavior.
Hi, Sydney, do you have anything to say about getting out of jail today?
2 words, malicious prosecution.
Do you think that that was fair to have served 2 out of 5 months?
Yeah, definitely.
What about the possibility of you going away and Tammy going away for a lot longer?
We've talked about it, because I mean, anything can happen. So we've talked about it. If everything goes the way it should, it won't happen, but we've talked about it. You have to prepare for the worst.
After being released from his 2-month stay in jail, Sidney took to Facebook, making some extremely long and accusatory posts about how everyone was failing Heather, because it was in fact her father Terry that had done something to her. He claimed that Terry had an extensive criminal history, and that he began doing things to Heather when she was just 4 years old, insinuating that he had been violating her in a very personal and sexual way. He also brought up that Terry had friends in the police force that helped him get away with it. Now, accusing family members and people who loved Heather most while they're still actively searching day in and day out for her is just absolutely sick, but honestly, not at all surprising from these people. It took another whole year before any court proceedings related to the case resumed. In July of 2017, a hearing was held to determine if Tammy had also violated the gag order and if she should be charged with contempt of court. The hearing and disposition were both kept private from the media. Sidney was tried on the obstruction charge regarding his initial lies about calling Heather on the payphone, which was already something we had known. 3 days later, Sidney was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison with credit for almost a year of time that he had served already. In April of 2018, Tammy and Sidney were each indicted on a single count of conspiracy to kidnap, in addition to the kidnapping charges that they were already facing. This threw the media into a whirlwind of questions, especially when Stuart Axelrod, a defense attorney in the area who had no connections to the case, claimed that you would have either had to have had some new evidence or somebody's rolling on somebody, referring to either of the Moores possibly testifying against each other. Stewart added they might be doing this to squeeze Tammy to try to rat out her husband, because that's the only way you're going to get a conspiracy conviction, is if the co-conspirator comes forward. And Tammy's court date, after all, was right around the corner. In October of 2018, Tammy went on trial. Prosecutors focused on not only the evidence from Sidney's mistrial, but the threatening text messages that Tammy had been sending to Heather. One of the texts that was shown in court that were sent just weeks before Heather's disappearance said, "Someone's about to get their ass beat down." They also showed the Facebook post from earlier where she was calling Heather a psycho whore. These text messages and posts made by Tammy helped the prosecution's theory that Tammy was a jealous and angry wife who wanted to get rid of her husband's mistress. The defense fought against Tammy having a motive of jealousy for kidnapping Heather. And if you remember from earlier, when Sidney had first reached out to Heather after their breakup, he had told her that Tammy wasn't mad because she had a lover too, and that she was mad because he had lied about the whole situation in general. The defense claimed that the couple was in an open relationship, so Tammy didn't mind at all that Sidney had been seeing Heather. And when Tammy took the stand, she even testified that she and Heather had a nice conversation that resolved any issues that the two of them had together, and that this conversation was only about a month prior to Heather's disappearance. This in itself seems a bit contradictory to me, because if you were in an open relationship and didn't care about their relationship, what issues would even have to be resolved between the two of them? Tammy's sister Ashley, the same one that was seen helping to clean out the truck, took the stand to testify against the claims that Tammy had been harmful towards Sidney and domineering after she found out about the affair. She claimed that the tattoo on Sidney's lower stomach was not at all something that Sidney was forced to get in order to save their marriage. She claimed that Sidney had gotten his tattoo in January of 2012, before he had even met Heather, and that she had the text messages between herself and the tattoo artist's wife to prove it. She also claimed that Tammy did not handcuff Sidney to the bed, but that they occasionally did use handcuffs for role-playing, which is just kind of funny to me and doesn't make much sense why she would know all of that unless she's in the bedroom with them every time. It's a little like TMI to me. But Tammy also discussed the handcuff situation while on the stand and claimed that they had a sleigh bed, which is when it's obviously in the shape of a sleigh and has no posts, adding that it had made it impossible for anyone to ever be handcuffed to it. The trial took 11 days, but the jury reached a verdict within just 4 hours of deliberation. Tammy Moore was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years for each count, all to run concurrently with credit for time served. Even though it took some time and was still not a murder charge, it seemed like some justice was finally being served.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Tammy Kaysen Moore, guilty of kidnapping.
I feel like I'm begging for my life for something that I didn't do, that I didn't have anything to do with.
Just one day after Tammy's trial ended, Heather's father, Terry, appeared in court to face a contempt charge. On the first day of Tammy's trial, Terry had yelled at the defense attorneys, calling them a lowlife and a piece of crap. Terry's attorney argued that Terry was extremely overwhelmed with everything happening, and that the defense attorney was using the bathroom on the side of the courthouse intended for the victims, therefore taunting him. However, he was still found guilty of contempt of court and given the option to either pay a $400 fine or spend 30 days in jail. In September of 2019, Sydney's retrial began. A lot of the testimony was the same as before, but during this trial, prosecutors touched on the security camera footage from outside of the Moore home that showed Sydney, Tammy, and Ashley cleaning the truck out, which was new evidence in the trial. The defense claimed that Tammy had bought Sydney a cleaning kit for Christmas that they had decided to use early, and that many people wash their trucks and many families in the area have burn piles all of the time. Tammy and Ashley were also seen in the video searching the yard with mirrors, which was another damning piece of evidence against them. Why would you need to search the yard with mirrors? The biggest testimony in this trial was from someone we had not heard yet from before. This person was Tammy's cousin, Donald DiMarino. Donald was a convicted criminal who had done time for burglary charges and drug charges. He testified in court that Sydney Moore had shown him a photo on his phone in 2014. This photo was allegedly of Heather, who was clearly deceased with blood on her shirt and scratches all over her face. When he was asked after seeing the picture if he expected the Elvis family to ever see their daughter again, his answer was simple: no. The jury took only 2 hours of deliberating this time around and found Sydney Moore guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap. Just like Tammy, he was sentenced to 2 30-year terms that would run concurrently in addition to his 10-year sentence for obstruction of justice. Just recently, in June of 2023, both Sydney and Tammy appealed for their convictions to be overturned. Tammy argued that the trial court erred in failing to grant her motion for a direct verdict, and Sydney argued that the trial court erred in changing the venue of his case in the county and denying his motion for a directed verdict in both the kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap charges. But thankfully, both of their appeals were denied. Even though the people responsible for Heather's disappearance are now behind bars, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. Heather's body has still not been found to this day. Investigators have searched both on land and in water, but no signs of Heather have turned up. Sydney and Tammy have continued to claim that they are innocent. Justice has partially been served in a way, but Heather's family still has no closure. Heather's 30th birthday would have been this past June. Her family held an event on the day of her birthday and focused on bringing awareness to other missing or unidentified people in the county. They hung missing persons posters instead of decorations, and they also painted rocks in honor of missing loved ones that were all placed at Heather's garden, located at Peachtree Landing. Heather's younger sister Morgan has dedicated her life to helping others who are experiencing the trauma with missing loved ones, just like she did. She is a nationally accredited victim advocate with more than 20 certifications specializing in missing persons. She works with 8 organizations in the field and also works as a guardian ad litem to represent children in South Carolina courts. I just know that her sister would be incredibly proud of her. Sydney and Tammy have claimed their innocence to this day, and Heather is presumed to be deceased. But the search for her body is still ongoing. So I would not only love to know your thoughts on this case and if you believe Sydney and Tammy are guilty and did in fact murder Heather, but please also take a quick moment to share this video because it could regain interest in Heather's case. It could lead to somebody who has a tip or heard something or overheard evidence, just like Sydney had shown that picture to the cousin. It could lead to more tips being generated and answers finally coming for Heather's family so that they could finally recover her body and lay her to rest. Let me know what you guys think about this case in the comments. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Please don't forget, subscribe to the channel, like this video on your way out, and I will be seeing you again very soon with another true crime case. All right, guys, thanks again, and until the next one, stay safe.